Long before the sea became an enemy, before maps divided land and water with certainty, there existed a coastline that no longer exists. It was not dramatic or legendary in its own time. It was simply home, a place where land stretched farther into the horizon, where tides behaved predictably, and where generations learned to read the ocean not as a threat, but as a partner. The people who lived there did not think of themselves as ancient. They thought of themselves as permanent. Their world was shaped by rhythm. Seasons came and went with consistency. The sea rose and fell as expected. Fish migrated on familiar routes. Stone outcroppings provided material. Forests provided shelter. Nothing about this environment suggested fragility. If anything, it rewarded patience and planning. This is why the first structures appeared not as monuments, but as solutions platforms to store food, walls to redirect water, paths that made movement easier across uneven land. Civilization didn't arrive suddenly. It accumulated over time. Those solutions became systems. Stone was no longer gathered randomly. It was selected, shaped, transported deliberately across distances that suggest coordination beyond family groups. This required knowledge, not just strength, but timing, leverage, and organization. These people understood how to move heavy things without breaking themselves. They understood balance. They understood limits. As generations passed, their settlements grew outward rather than upward. Instead of towering structures meant to dominate the landscape, they built wide, stable foundations meant to endure it. Streets aligned naturally with the terrain. Buildings followed contours rather than forcing straight lines. This was a civilization that adapted to its environment instead of trying to conquer it. And that is precisely why its disappearance is so unsettling. Because civilizations that vanish violently leave scars, burn layers, weapons, bodies. This one does not. What it leaves behind suggests confidence, not desperation. Long-term planning, not short-term survival. Which means whatever ended, it was not something they believed they could fight. At the height of its existence, the city near the sea was alive with movement, not chaos, movement with purpose. People traveled between districts on stone paths worn smooth by centuries of use. Storage areas were elevated against moisture. Sacred spaces were separated from daily life, not to isolate belief, but to protect it. Everything had a place, and everything suggested continuity. Children grew up expecting to inherit this world unchanged. But the first warning signs did not announce themselves as warnings. They arrived disguised as anomalies. The kind that can be ignored without consequence at first. A tide that lingered longer than usual. Salt creeping farther inland, fish appearing in unfamiliar patterns. None of this triggered alarm. Environmental change rarely does. It takes time before irregularity becomes threat. And by the time patterns are recognized, adaptation becomes urgent rather than optional. The people responded the way stable societies always do, with adjustment, not fear. Walkways were raised slightly. Storage methods were altered. Ritual calendars shifted to account for changing seasons. These were intelligent responses, reasonable responses, the kind that work until they don't. What makes this civilization remarkable is not that it failed to adapt, but that it adapted too late. As the shoreline slowly redrew itself, the city remained functional. Life went on. Trade continued. Ceremonies were held. Architecture remained intact. To an outside observer, nothing appeared wrong. That is the danger of slow collapse. It hides inside normalcy. But beneath the surface, the ground was changing. Water tables rose. Foundations that had once been dry began to absorb moisture. Stone, though strong, remembers pressure. Microfractures formed where none had existed before. Not enough to destroy buildings, but enough to weaken certainty. The leaders of the city, whether political, spiritual, or practical, is something we no longer know. Their authority was not recorded in writing that survived. But the coordination evident in later actions suggests a shared understanding rather than enforced control. Decisions were made collectively, or at least accepted widely. There is no evidence of rebellion, no signs of panic, which leads to a disturbing possibility. What if they understood exactly what was happening and knew it could not be stopped? As sea levels continued their subtle rise, the city's relationship with water shifted. What was once predictable became invasive. Wells tasted different. Foundations darkened with moisture. Certain districts became less desirable to inhabit. Families relocated internally first, moving toward higher ground, adjusting without abandoning identity. But eventually, the limits of adaptation became clear. This land was not stabilizing. It was transitioning. At some point, likely within a single generation, the realization set in that the environment which made this civilization possible no longer existed. Not temporarily, permanently. No amount of engineering could reverse the process. No ritual could restore balance. This was not punishment or failure. It was geology, climate, time. The decision that followed was not recorded, but it is written into the evidence itself. They did not strip the city of resources. They did not dismantle structures for reuse elsewhere. They did not burn what they could not carry. Instead, they prepared to leave in a way that suggests expectational, not hope of return, but acceptance of departure. Valuables remained. Tools were placed carefully. Sacred areas were closed rather than destroyed. This was not abandonment born of fear. It was withdrawal born of understanding. And this is where the story truly begins. Because civilizations don't vanish when they are destroyed. They vanish when they choose to step away. The city had endured countless cycles of nature, storms, tides, and seasonal floods. Each time, the inhabitants adapted, raising walls, rerouting water, modifying schedules, recalculating food storage. Their understanding of the land and sea was sophisticated. They did not survive through luck. They survived through careful observation and planning. And yet, all that skill could not protect them from what came next. The first irreversible shift was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it changed everything. It began in the water. The tides no longer receded the way they had for generations. The familiar ebb that allowed fishermen to safely navigate the shallows, that enabled farmers to irrigate fields predictably, that defined the rhythm of life, this ebb became inconsistent. At first, it was minor. Boats scraped previously dry stone. Saltwater reached farmland only occasionally. People assumed anomalies, strange weather, or miscalculations. But then, over years, anomalies compounded. Streams redirected themselves. Wells brackish with intrusion began contaminating even the highest aquifers. Food storage, once a predictable system, became unreliable. Leadership convened councils, likely a mixture of elders, priests, and skilled engineers. Decisions were pragmatic. They reinforced walls. They shifted dwellings to higher ground. They relocated the most critical functions: granaries, workshops, sacred spaces. They documented what they could, although few of these records survive beyond fragments of stone and memory. This was not panic, it was organized mitigation. But adaptation has limits, and nature had passed them. Ground once solid began shifting underfoot. Foundations cracked subtly, like veins in stone, betraying centuries of stability. Buildings that had withstood decades of seasonal water expansion now sagged slightly, silently. Even the heaviest blocks, stacked and interlocked with care, began to reveal the consequences of constant, invisible pressure. The city was not collapsing in a dramatic fashion. It was weakening in ways too gradual for the inhabitants to immediately comprehend, but fast enough that the cumulative effect could no longer be reversed. Every problem in isolation was manageable, every anomalies, but when these anomalies began to intersect, the civilization faced a system-level failure. Water contamination, unstable foundations, disrupted food production, diminishing trade routes, and an increasingly fragmented population. No single solution could restore stability. The city's survival relied on a network of dependent systems, and each failure strained the others. Psychologically, this must have been disorienting. Humans live well when the world behaves predictably. When predictable patterns break, anxiety spreads. Subtly at first, families rearranged routines, avoiding districts that flooded. Fishermen ventured further for food, often returning with nothing or unfamiliar species. Children grew wary of previously safe paths, and yet outwardly, the city functioned. Markets opened, festivals continued, life seemed normal. The very normalcy concealed the truth. The ground beneath their feet no longer supported permanence. Leaders faced the impossible. If they publicly acknowledged that the city's foundations, both literal and social, were failing, they risked panic. Panic would have shattered what little cohesion remained, possibly accelerating destruction. But silence came at a cost. People continued routines under false assumptions. They invested effort into repairs that could never last. Each stone replaced, each embankment rebuilt, was a temporary fix masking inevitable decline. And then came the tides that no one could ignore. One winter, unusually high water breached the northern platforms, flooding granaries that had never seen moisture. The storage of surplus food, a cornerstone of the city's resilience, was compromised. The elders knew this breach was not a singular event. They knew it would recur, worse each season. The sea had begun to reclaim the city slowly, deliberately, and the normal cycles of life could no longer counterbalance it. At this point, the first critical decisions were made. Families were moved internally, elevated areas were prioritized, sacred sites were reinforced, but no one spoke openly of leaving. Leaving implied acknowledgement of failure, and failure was a concept the city could not yet accept publicly. Practicality dictated action without announcement. Resources distributed, vulnerable groups relocated, critical paths adjusted. The population was surviving, but survival had shifted from thriving to mere endurance. By the end of this phase, the city was calm in appearance, but the undercurrent of knowledge ran deep. Leaders and key figures understood the truth. The civilization could not continue as it had. Every solution was temporary. Every adjustment postponed the inevitable. Their mastery over stone, water, and trade could not stop the ocean's slow advance. And yet, they acted as if tomorrow would still follow yesterday. It was a civilization balancing on a knife edge. One misstep, one unexpected storm, one failure of coordination, and everything would unravel. And eventually, that misstep would come. No city ever abandons itself without choice. And this city, despite centuries of mastery over stone, water, and trade, made the single most difficult decision in human history: to step away from what they had built with their own hands. There were no speeches, no recorded decrees, The evidence lies in the silence of abandoned structures, in carefully placed tools, in granaries partially stocked, and in dwellings left intact. Departure was deliberate. It was methodical. It was a choice made not in panic, but with profound understanding. The first stage was internal relocation. Families were moved from districts most affected by the rising tides to higher platforms that had previously been reserved for ceremonial or administrative use. Children carried belongings, elders were assisted with care, and livestock where feasible was guided to safer ground. No frantic chaos marks the archaeological record. Instead, where patterns in stone indicate slow, controlled movement, the careful footsteps of people who knew they would never return. Next came the consolidation of resources. Supplies that could not be carried remained carefully stored. Valuables were not looted or destroyed. Sacred objects were left in place but closed off, indicating respect for the spaces even in departure. The city's engineers likely calculated the minimum effort required to sustain life while minimizing exposure to collapse. Every action suggests intelligence, planning, and emotional discipline of civilization, acknowledging the end without succumbing to despair. Even daily life continued to an astonishing degree. Markets operated, though with fewer traders. Children played within designated zones. Craftspeople maintained workshops. To the casual observer, the city appeared normal, yet the undercurrent was unmistakable. The civilization had internally recognized the futility of permanence. The ocean would not wait for their hesitation. Time had become a force more powerful than rulers, more compelling than law or tradition. The psychological tension must have been immense. Parents watched as younger generations prepared for a journey whose scale and uncertainty they could scarcely imagine. Elders, custodians of knowledge and memory, understood that stories might not survive. Each family had to decide what to take, what to leave, and what to preserve in memory alone. Knowledge became intangible, ritual, technique. Stories encoded in gestures and rhythm rather than written word, for the written medium was too fragile to outlast them. Departure began quietly over weeks and months. Paths show were consistent with repeated small-scale movement rather than a mass exodus. Boats were employed, though evidence suggests they carried only essentials and the most mobile families. Those who could walk led the way. Those who could not were assisted. The city's departure was not a dramatic flight but a slow exfiltration, measured, deliberate, and heartbreaking. And then the final families left. No one stayed behind to watch. No one returned to wave goodbye. The streets, now empty, still held the echo of human presence. Tools on benches, small tokens of daily life, stone thresholds carefully cleaned. The city, at the moment of its abandonment, was not destroyed. It was paused, a living memory frozen in time, waiting for eyes that would not come for thousands of years. The water did not need to rush. It did not need to claim the land violently. In the centuries that followed, the ocean rose steadily. Sediment accumulated. Storms reshaped the terrain, and the city was slowly, silently consumed. What had once been a hub of human activity became a ghostly monument, preserved not as warning but as evidence. A civilization that understood its limits and acted accordingly. This was no accidental disappearance. It was a conscious surrender to forces they could not control. Theirs was a civilization that had mastered stone, water, trade, and community, yet acknowledged that mastery has boundaries. The city's absence teaches what no written history can. Permanence is illusion, and survival sometimes means stepping aside. Once the city was abandoned, its physical structures began to vanish slowly, but its presence did not entirely disappear from the world. Nearby communities inherited fragments of memory, small details that could not be erased by the passage of time. Fishermen told stories of strange stone platforms submerged just beyond familiar shoals, of walls that emerged only during unusually low tides, and of pathways that seemed to lead nowhere. These tales were passed orally, growing into myth. The people did not understand what they described, but instinctively, they preserved it. There is a peculiar power in myth. It survives when history fails. Over generations, the vanished city became a ghost in human consciousness. The original purpose of its stonework, the logistics that had sustained its population, the careful planning that had governed its rise, all of this was lost to anyone alive centuries later. What remained were impressions. A city swallowed by the sea, people who disappeared, places too dangerous to enter. Repetition transformed fact into legend, and legend into cautionary tale. In some traditions, the city became a metaphor for hubris. In others, a warning about the wrath of nature. In still others, a story about ancestors who possessed knowledge far beyond the ordinary. This was the invisible layer of collapse, cultural evaporation. Unlike ruins that crumble under fire or invasion, this city's story survived only as partial memory, heavily filtered and reshaped. Archaeologists and historians centuries later would discover structures and stones, but the narrative, the why, the how was gone. Observers could measure the weight of stones, the alignment of walls, and the sophistication of platforms, yet they could not perceive the human decisions behind them. They saw genius without context, precision without intent, and silence instead of explanation. Memory decayed deliberately, almost as if the vanished civilization understood that its knowledge could be dangerous if misapplied. Knowledge, after all, requires a stable society to preserve it. Without systems, without continuity, the most advanced techniques are useless or, worse, destabilizing. Perhaps the city's leaders recognized this, leaving behind only what could survive scrutiny without misinterpretation: stone, placement, and subtle markers of alignment. Everything else, the intricate social contracts, the calendars, the rituals, was left in human memory, fragile and unrecorded. Nearby populations who did attempt to rebuild in the region were cautious. Evidence suggests they avoided areas once occupied, not because of superstition alone, but because the land itself had changed. Floods had altered paths, water tables had shifted, and sediment had transformed the landscape. Nature, combined with human wisdom, created a buffer between the past and the present. The city remained inaccessible, enigmatic, and mostly invisible. Yet its imprint lingered in stories, rituals, and indirect influence. This is the haunting legacy of civilizations that vanish without violence. The stones remain as evidence, yet they cannot speak. The memory survives only in fragmentary form, evolving into myths that reflect not the full reality, but the perceived truth. Modern explorers, satellite imagery, and underwater surveys have revealed traces of these cities. But the human story, the laughter, the labor, the decisions remains hidden beneath layers of water, sediment, and time. And perhaps this was exactly what the vanished city intended. Its absence, its silence, and its invisibility became its message. Permanence is fleeting. Civilization can be brilliant and yet ephemeral. Knowledge without continuity is fragile. The past does not warn the present in words. It whispers in structures, in anomalies, in stories reshaped by memory. Centuries passed before anyone dared to return to the site of the vanished city. Time, tides, and sediment had altered the landscape beyond recognition. What had once been streets and plazas was now irregular stone formations protruding from sand, shallow water, and mud. For generations, locals avoided the area, repeating cryptic oral traditions. Do not linger where the land once breathed with people. To them, the ruins were a cautionary echo, something better left untouched. Then came outsiders, explorers, scholars, and eventually archaeologists. They approached with instruments, maps, and a desire to record. When they first saw the stones, they were confounded. Alignments suggested deliberate planning. Measured distances, interlocking blocks, and astronomical orientation could not have arisen by chance. The sheer scale of the construction defied explanations available at the time. Whoever built this city had skill, resources, and knowledge that exceeded assumptions about humanity at the supposed time of primitive. Initial investigations focused on speculation. Some proposed lost civilizations connected by unknown trade networks. Others suggested myth had been misinterpreted into reality. Researchers took core samples, mapped platforms, and cataloged anomalies, but these attempts to categorize the site felt insufficient. The city resisted classification, as if demanding recognition not as a curiosity, but as a lesson. Modern technology eventually revealed more. Sonar scans, satellite imagery, and underwater excavation uncovered additional structures. Stairways leading nowhere, walls aligned with solstices, and stones too massive for conventional explanations of transport. Each discovery deepened the mystery. Why abandon so much wealth? Why leave structures intact when departure could have been easier through destruction? The answer, increasingly, seemed not external, but internal. The vanished city was not erased by violence. It was erased by choice. Its silence was deliberate. Its memory was curated through absence. Modern explorers were discovering only fragments, the pieces that time and nature allowed to survive. The psychological weight of these fragments became palpable. People who had studied the ruins extensively reported a strange emotional response, awe mixed with discomfort. There was beauty in the design, but also an unmistakable warning embedded in its decay. The structures were not inviting, they were challenging. Even advanced equipment could not answer the question of intent. Every alignment, every interlocking stone, every empty street whispered the same message. Civilization is not permanent. Systems that seem stable can falter in ways impossible to predict. Knowledge left without continuity becomes lost. Human ingenuity is only as enduring as the society that sustains it. Those who studied the ruins began to notice patterns consistent with what had been recorded in oral traditions. The city had disappeared not due to war or catastrophe, but due to environmental and systemic failure, coupled with deliberate human withdrawal. This realization reframed the narrative of lost civilizations entirely. It was no longer a story of disaster but of foresight, of knowing when to step aside. The vanished city had become a guide, a silent instructor in human resilience, adaptation, and humility. Rediscovery did not restore life to the city. It only allowed modern humans to glimpse the fragility of civilization. Stone remained, but voices were gone. Streets were intact, but footsteps were absent. Platforms held weight, but no hands built them anymore. And yet, paradoxically, the absence amplified understanding. scholars began to see the patterns of decision-making, the logistics of withdrawal, and the subtle art of knowledge preservation through silence. In this phase, the psychological impact of rediscovery cannot be overstated. Modern civilization, confident in its permanence and technological mastery, confronted a civilization that had achieved complexity, mastered its environment, and still vanished. The juxtaposition was unsettling. We imagined disaster as loud and visible, yet the vanished city demonstrated that disappearance can be quiet, deliberate, and absolute. The city's legacy is not in the stones themselves, it is in what the stones teach us, that ingenuity without adaptability is fragile, that mastery is temporary, and that civilizations, no matter how advanced, are accountable to forces they cannot control. The city's final lesson is embedded in absence itself. Permanence is an illusion, and the measure of civilization is not its endurance, but its awareness of limits. Modern research into the vanished city reveals astonishing insights, not just about the structures themselves, but about how humans interact with their environment. Advanced technology allows for detailed mapping of foundations, walls, and roads submerged beneath sediment and water. Satellite imagery shows patterns invisible to the naked eye, alignments, grids, and orientations designed to withstand environmental change. Even partial analysis of stone composition demonstrates transport across distances previously assumed impossible for societies of that era. Archaeologists compared this city with other vanished civilizations, like the cities submerged off the coast of India, the megalithic ruins of Nan Madol in Micronesia, and certain pre-Columbian settlements along now-flooded river valleys. Patterns emerge. Each site shares key traits: precision engineering, strategic placement relative to water, extensive resource management, and a sudden deliberate departure rather than destruction. These civilizations did not vanish from catastrophe alone. They vanished by choice, guided by observation and necessity. The scientific data corroborates oral histories. Sediment cores reveal rising sea levels, consistent with environmental shifts described in myths. Botanical remains indicate crops failed in specific areas at specific times, forcing gradual internal migration within settlements. Water analysis shows contamination patterns aligning with structural abandonment. There is no evidence of widespread warfare or epidemic at the time of departure. Death did not drive the exodus, logic did. This leads to a compelling theory. The city's disappearance was a strategic retreat, a form of early survival planning on a societal scale. By leaving intact structures behind and dispersing populations, the civilization ensured continuity of life, if not continuity of place. Families migrated, merging with neighboring populations. Knowledge, skills, and cultural memory traveled with them, but the city itself was preserved only in stone, waiting silently under sediment and water. Researchers noted the psychological aspect as well. The care taken to leave dwellings intact, to close sacred spaces respectfully, to avoid panic. These behaviors suggest an awareness of legacy. The vanished civilization understood that abandonment could preserve lessons for future generations, even if direct survival was impossible. They encoded their choices in absence itself, creating a puzzle for future observers. Interestingly, this pattern is repeated across multiple vanished civilizations. Societies that collapse violently often leave chaos, burned structures, mass graves, ruined artifacts. Societies that vanish deliberately leave subtle guidance, intact architecture, clear evidence of planning, controlled exodus. Modern scientists now use these patterns to differentiate natural disaster collapse from strategic withdrawal. For the public, the rediscovery of this city evokes awe and discomfort in equal measure. The sophistication challenges assumptions about primitive societies. The deliberate disappearance challenges assumptions about human behavior, and the combination technological mastery, paired with environmental respect, hovers a haunting mirror. A civilization capable of incredible achievements can still recognize its limits and step aside gracefully. This insight reframes the way we understand vanished civilizations. It is no longer sufficient to catalog ruins and estimate dates. Modern researchers must interpret human decisions, environmental awareness, and social structures, all reconstructed through the indirect clues left behind. Stone alone tells one story. Patterns of movement, placement, and preservation tell another, a story of foresight, restraint, and quiet endurance. Moreover, this approach allows historians to reconsider myths worldwide. Many oral traditions, previously dismissed as allegorical, now correspond to real, observable phenomena: flooding, rising seas, migration, abandonment. Legends of lost cities and sunken civilizations may not be fantasy, they may be memory filtered through generations, compressed into metaphor, yet accurate in essence. In this light, science and myth converge. Archaeology provides evidence, geology provides context, and anthropology provides the human interpretation. The city, once active and vibrant, now communicates only through this interdisciplinary lens. Observers learn not what the city built, but why it chose to vanish, and this lesson resonates today. When the final families departed from the sunken city, they did not vanish into nothing. They dispersed across nearby regions, traveling on foot, by river, and in simple boats, carrying only what could be transported. Their journey was dictated by both necessity and knowledge. Fertile land, accessible water, and shelter determined their paths. Yet this was not a mere flight for survival. It was a migration guided by purpose, preserving what could not be left behind: skills, rituals, and communal knowledge. Along the journey, these people encountered other communities. Some welcomed them, others observed cautiously. The migrating population brought with it not just survival skills, but also unique engineering practices, agricultural knowledge, and social organization. They merged selectively, blending traditions with existing practices. Over generations, the traces of the vanished city appeared subtly in new settlements: stonework patterns, water management strategies, astronomical alignments, and ritual sites that mimicked the original city's sacred structures. Remarkably, much of the vanished civilization's knowledge survived orally, encoded in myths, songs, and gestures. Children were taught lessons through story rather than instruction, rhythms rather than manuals. For example, fishing techniques adapted from tidal understanding, techniques of stone cutting, or seasonal agricultural cycles were passed down as allegories. Follow the path of the rising moon, or plant where water kisses the earth first. To outsiders, these were symbolic tales. To the initiated, they were practical instructions encoded in cultural memory. Anthropologists studying these dispersed populations note an extraordinary psychological phenomenon. A dual identity emerged. Descendants remembered the lost city as both home and myth. They did not attempt to rebuild it directly, perhaps intuitively recognizing the environmental constraints that forced its abandonment. Instead, the memory served as a cultural compass, guiding settlements while teaching humility, resilience, and respect for environmental limits. The migration was gradual. Families moved in stages, sometimes pausing for decades in intermediate regions, establishing semi-permanent camps that allowed the next generation to stabilize before continuing. Trade networks developed among these transient communities, connecting river valleys, coastal areas, and inland regions. The dispersed population contributed disproportionately to innovations in transport, food preservation, and urban planning. Every migration step carried fragments of the vanished city's civilization. Though stripped of its monumental scale and centralized authority, interestingly, some groups deliberately avoided areas that had been part of the city, creating what might be called psychological buffer zones. Even centuries later, archaeologists notice sparsely populated regions around the original site. This avoidance pattern appears repeatedly. Communities respected not only natural boundaries but historical memory, encoded in stories warning against returning. The vanished city's absence thus structured future settlement patterns, shaping culture indirectly without a single written record. This cultural fusion produced a hybrid legacy. Societies that emerged in the wake of the migration displayed subtle architectural echoes: stepped stone platforms reminiscent of ceremonial spaces, elevated homes for flood resilience, and water channels designed for predictable irrigation. These practical adaptations were combined with new aesthetic and social interpretations, creating distinct cultures that bore silent witness to the vanished city's ingenuity. Perhaps the most fascinating outcome was the preservation of social cohesion principles. Even in diaspora, the original city's methods of governance, communal decision-making, and dispute resolution survived through oral tradition and ritual. Elders taught younger generations not just survival skills, but also the ethics of collaboration, the importance of shared responsibility, and the need to respect both human and natural systems. These principles became embedded in new civilizations, influencing trade, law, and religious practices in subtle ways. Ultimately, the vanished city's migration was not merely a story of displacement. It was the continuation of civilization in human memory and practice, even as the physical structures disappeared beneath sediment and sea. What seemed like loss became, paradoxically, a seedbed for new societies. The city's legacy was no longer stone and mortar. It was encoded in human behavior, culture, and knowledge, waiting for modern explorers to reconstruct the invisible threads connecting past and present. Long after the physical structures had disappeared beneath the encroaching sea and shifting sands, the vanished city persisted in human consciousness not as history, but as myth. Oral traditions passed down through generations transformed the city into a legend of immense power and subtle warning. Elders spoke of a place of stone and water, where people lived in harmony with tides, yet vanished when the land could no longer support them. Children learned caution through story. Adults recalled wisdom through ritual. The myths were layered, blending truth and symbolism. In some regions, the city became a tale of hubris, punished by nature, a story cautioning against human arrogance. In others, it became a tale of foresight and careful planning, teaching that survival sometimes requires stepping aside rather than confronting impossible odds. These legends evolved naturally over centuries, shaped by environment, culture, and memory, embedding the vanished city in a symbolic form that persisted far longer than any written record could have survived. Archaeological research confirms that even artistic traditions carried echoes of the city's design and purpose. Motifs in pottery, carvings in stone, and decorative patterns in textiles suggest symbolic alignment with the city's original structures. Geometric patterns found in distant settlements mirror stone arrangements of the vanished city. Some rituals celebrated tides, moon phases, or seasonal cycles, the same environmental rhythms that had dictated life and departure in the original city. Symbolic preservation allowed the essence of the civilization to influence future cultures indirectly. Language, too, became a vessel of memory. Words describing certain construction techniques, trade practices, or environmental phenomena appear in multiple descendant communities, often retaining their original function but repurposed for local adaptation. In subtle ways, the vanished city's knowledge persisted, encoded linguistically, socially, and ritually, shaping regional development across generations. The psychological impact of these myths was profound. Communities growing up with stories of a lost city internalized lessons about environmental respect, resource management, and communal decision-making. Even without direct experience of the city, descendants absorbed its core principles, demonstrating that civilization's influence can extend beyond its physical lifespan. Memory became both inheritance and guide, a compass pointing to human resilience and caution. Interestingly, as centuries passed, the vanished city's legend expanded geographically. Sailors, traders, and pilgrims carried stories far from the original site, blending them with local narratives. By the time the first modern explorers approached the remnants, the city was already more myth than reality. A multi-layered story whose truth could only be partially reconstructed. This is why rediscovery evokes both awe and confusion. The city exists materially, but its meaning survives primarily through human memory and interpretation. The vanished city, in essence, became a living symbol. Its silence, its absence, and its deliberate disappearance were remembered more powerfully than if it had been destroyed violently. Myths conveyed the lessons of its collapse: environmental awareness, the fragility of systems, the limits of human mastery, and the ethics of foresight. Every generation that inherited these stories learned from a civilization they never saw, preserving wisdom embedded in stone, water, and narrative. This symbolic memory, however, was fragile. Without careful transmission, myths evolved unpredictably. Some elements were exaggerated, others were lost entirely. Legends sometimes merged with unrelated stories, creating confusion for historians centuries later. Yet even in distortion, the essence of the vanished city remained an invisible guide for human behavior, a reminder of both ingenuity and humility, and a testament to a civilization that vanished deliberately yet left a profound impact on its successors. When modern explorers first approached the site of the vanished city, they were confronted with something both familiar and alien. At first glance, the structures were mere remnants: stone platforms, fractured walls, partially submerged foundations, but closer inspection revealed remarkable sophistication. Each block, carefully cut and aligned, reflected a mastery of engineering that rivaled contemporaneous civilizations thousands of miles apart. Roads aligned with precision, water channels followed natural gradients but indicated advanced planning. Platforms were elevated just enough to survive moderate floods. Every detail suggested deliberate design and long-term consideration. Archaeologists and historians quickly realized that no single discipline could make sense of the city alone. Geologists analyzed sediment layers to reconstruct historical sea levels. Anthropologists studied regional myths and oral traditions to map the social and cultural context. Engineers attempted to replicate construction techniques, revealing an intricate understanding of leverage, balance, and structural integrity. Even climatologists contributed, demonstrating how gradual environmental shifts could have stressed urban infrastructure over centuries. One of the most compelling discoveries involved the patterns of abandonment. Unlike other ruins marked by fire, destruction, or hasty departure, the vanished city left careful traces of withdrawal. Workshops were intact. Granaries remained stocked, though partially depleted. Houses were cleared but not dismantled. Sacred spaces were respectfully closed rather than desecrated. These signs suggested planning and discipline, implying that the people understood they were leaving forever, but did so methodically, with minimal disruption. The convergence of disciplines allowed researchers to reconstruct daily life with surprising clarity. Streets indicate patterns of movement. Commercial districts, residential zones, ceremonial spaces, artifacts show evidence of sophisticated craft, trade, and knowledge transfer. Tool marks reveal advanced stone-cutting techniques. Even the placement of objects within houses suggests social hierarchy, communal priorities, and ritual practices. The civilization was complex, adaptive, and deeply aware of its environment, but ultimately aware enough to recognize its own limits. Modern observers also noted a profound psychological effect. Standing among the ruins, researchers describe a mixture of awe, humility, and unease. The city's silence conveys a lesson. Human ingenuity is temporary, and even the most advanced societies are vulnerable to slow, inevitable forces. Unlike dramatic catastrophes, which provide spectacle and narrative closure, the city's disappearance offers a quiet, almost existential reflection. Civilization does not always end with fire or invasion. Sometimes, it ends because it chooses to leave. The interpretation of myths and legends further enriched this understanding. Stories of sunken cities, vanishing people, and warnings encoded in song or ritual matched observable evidence. Myths preserved the core lessons: rising waters, environmental instability, and the importance of adaptation. These narratives, often dismissed as folklore, were now recognized as encoded, history distorted, symbolic, but rooted in fact. The vanished city had not only physically disappeared, but had also deliberately shaped the memory of its absence. Cross-disciplinary studies revealed that the city's departure likely influenced neighboring civilizations more than previously imagined. Techniques in water management, architecture, social organization, and ritual practice appeared in regions far from the original site. Knowledge transfer occurred not through written record but through migration, interaction, and cultural fusion. Descendants carried practical knowledge as well as myths, embedding fragments of the vanished city into new societies. The city's legacy, therefore, is multidimensional. It is physical: foundations, platforms, and aligned structures that withstand centuries underwater. It is cultural: myths, rituals, and linguistic traces that guide generations. And it is psychological: a silent warning about the fragility of human systems, the limits of mastery, and the power of foresight. Modern reconstruction does not merely reveal the past. It reflects timeless truths about civilization, resilience, and human perception. Finally, the study of the vanished city has implications beyond archaeology. Urban planners, environmental scientists, and policymakers now consider lessons from the city when addressing climate change, rising sea levels, and the sustainability of complex systems. The city's disappearance demonstrates that awareness of limits and strategic adaptation or retreat may be as critical to survival as technological advancement. Humanity, it seems, still has much to learn from those who vanished deliberately, leaving both stone and silence as their enduring instruction. The last generations of the vanished city lived in a delicate balance between memory and inevitability. By this stage, rising tides and shifting soil had rendered much of the city's lower districts uninhabitable. Families relocated internally, moving from once vibrant streets to elevated platforms and higher terraces. The city's rhythm slowed, not because life ended, but because every step had become purposeful and measured. Children grew up understanding a subtle tension in daily life. Play was allowed. Markets still functioned, yet a quiet awareness lingered that the world beneath their feet was changing irreversibly. Archaeological evidence indicates that even as water intruded, inhabitants maintained routines meticulously. Granaries were elevated, homes repaired repeatedly, and sacred spaces remained respected. These behaviors suggest a conscious effort to preserve normalcy while anticipating departure. It was not fear that dictated their actions, but discipline and understanding of society teaching its youngest how to endure without panic, how to respect the land even as it betrayed them, and how to carry knowledge forward into a world they would soon inhabit differently. Daily life in these final years reveals a striking human resilience. Children played in limited zones, aware of rising water, but not entirely understanding its inevitability. Elders passed down knowledge orally, teaching not just skills but the reasoning behind them, how to anticipate environmental changes, manage scarce resources, and maintain social cohesion under stress. Craftspeople and builders continued their work, refining techniques that would be carried into future societies, even as the original city slowly faded from daily use. Rituals, too, adapted to the changing environment. Ceremonies once held in open plazas moved to higher platforms, incorporating water as a symbolic and practical element. Some rituals seem to have acknowledged the city's impermanence, offering prayers for safe passage, survival, and the preservation of knowledge. Archaeologists find remnants of these practices in artifacts carefully placed, symbolic carvings, and elevated offerings. The last inhabitants were not abandoning culture, they were preserving it. Evidence of the final exodus is subtle but profound. Paths worn and repeated, measured use indicate the movement of families and belongings toward higher ground or temporary settlements beyond the city's central area. Boats carried essentials across short stretches of water, leaving behind structures carefully maintained until departure. Unlike a chaotic evacuation, these traces show discipline, foresight, and acceptance of civilization, knowing its limits and acting accordingly. The psychological imprint of leaving home is visible even in fragments. Children's play areas were left untouched, likely as a gesture of care or hope. Tools were stacked neatly, not scavenged or destroyed. Houses show signs of cleaning, not hurried abandonment. Even in the face of inevitable disappearance, the city's inhabitants maintained respect for both the environment and each other, creating a legacy encoded not in records, but in stone, organization, and human behavior. By the time the last families left, the city was already partially submerged. Water had begun reclaiming streets and lower districts. Sediment washed into marketplaces. Foundations softened. Yet above all, there was no visible panic. Life had slowed but not stopped. Departure was not an act of desperation but of deliberate understanding. The city's final act was calm, purposeful withdrawal, leaving behind both the physical structures and a profound lesson for generations to come. This transformation from thriving metropolis to partially submerged, disciplined abandonment, blurred the line between living city and legend. For centuries afterward, stories circulated, a city that disappears without warning, yet leaves its streets and treasures for the wise to find. Memory, myth, and archaeology would eventually converge, revealing both the intelligence of the final generations and the slow, inevitable power of environmental forces that shaped their destiny.